Good evening, everybody. It's good of you to come out on such a hot evening. It's been a great day, hasn't it? And it's good to see summer around. Long may it continue, I say. Well, as Chris reminded us, we're partway through a series, and so far we've seen Peter's sermons, day of Pentecost, and then in the temple, the raising of the healing of the lame man, and then Peter's sermon to Cornelius, the centurion, and then last week we were looking at Paul's sermon in the synagogue. And the thing that is common about all of those, even though the preaching was to Jews and Gentiles, it was to God-fearing Gentiles. So basically, all these people had the same worldview. They actually had a worldview that they knew that God was in control. They had a desire to worship the one God, the true God. But tonight, things change. As we read, Paul finds himself in Athens. He hadn't planned to go there, but he'd been hounded out of one town and then the next, and shipped out to Athens by his friends to wait for them there. And, you know, as you do when you're in a new city and you've got a few, hours to spare, a few days to spare, you relax, don't you? Not if you're the Apostle Paul. You go into that city, you find out what's going on, you hear what people are talking about. And he walked around and he saw what people were worshipping. He looked at all the different altars they had, because it was quite a city for altars. And that started to stir him up. Because he was seeing people who had a worldview that was so different from the worldview of his Jewish ancestry. A worldview of many gods. So in his usual way, Paul goes into the synagogue first, and he preaches to those who share his worldview. But he was so concerned about the other people, he went into the marketplace. And that's the message that we're going to be looking at tonight. Good news for the marketplace. Now, when you think of the marketplace, perhaps you think of something like the pictures that are just going to come up. That's a marketplace. Actually, there's two. One's the famous Pike Marketplace in Seattle, and the other one's actually in downtown Vancouver. But marketplaces the world over are so similar, aren't they? It's where people buy and sell. It's where people congregate and looking for a bargain, looking for a good deal. But the marketplace that Paul went to in Athens, that's the ruins of it, and they not only traded in goods, they traded in ideas. Athens was the place where Socrates had been, the famous philosopher, Plato. It was the place where philosophers met to share ideas and to present ideas. And as the message translated, downtown Athens was a great place for gossip. There are always people hanging around, natives and tourists alike, waiting for the latest tidbit on most anything. It was the gossip centre. They wanted news. Here comes Paul, and he moves around amongst the people there, debating with them, talking with them. Went out into the marketplace. How about you? Where's your marketplace? Tonight, we're sat in a church where probably all of us, certainly the majority of us, share a common worldview. We believe in one God. We're here to worship that one God. But tomorrow, perhaps even tonight when you go home, you'll be going into the marketplace. You go to places where people have other ideas. Some worship many gods, some worship no gods. You're in the marketplace. Where is it that you know where people gossip, where people are willing to sit down and chat? This last week I was, for a few days, in my daughter's village in Redbourne in Hertfordshire. And being a hot evening on Thursday, my wife and I went for a walk round the village green, which is quite a big village green. It's got cricket going on there. And we walked past the Cricketers' Arms. And it was heaving with people gathered around the door, drinking and talking. And then in the gardens, where there were sort of tables and that, there were masses of people. And they were all talking, they were gossiping. That was quite a marketplace. So maybe the local pub is your marketplace, or the local coffee shop. Now I want you to think, where's your marketplace? You know, we think it's so important that each of us gets to know where our marketplace is, where we can gossip about Jesus Christ. That starting September, our small groups are doing a series called Life on the Front Line. And it's about equipment for whole life discipleship. And part of that course is actually going to be exploring, where's your marketplace? And you know, we think it's so important that the Equip stream are going to be running with it as well. So there's no excuse for escaping doing that course, looking at how you can be an active Christian in your marketplace, where God has placed you, where you can listen to what different people are talking about and saying, and think how you can make a difference in that marketplace. So let's have a look who's in the marketplace with Paul. Well, first of all, we see that there's those who happen to be there. That's true of most marketplaces. There are people who just happen to be there. You know, they've got nothing better to do, so they go off and find out what's going in the marketplace. And so Paul, he got alongside the people who just happened to be there. You know, it says that he was addressing the Jews and God-fearing Gentiles in the synagogue. That was his Sabbath day. And then in the marketplace every day, those who happened to be there. And it wasn't that he was necessarily standing up and preaching. He was talking, asking them questions, finding out where they were coming from, planting ideas into their minds, and then starting to tell them about Jesus and the resurrection. So there are those who happen to be there. So you need to look around when you go to your marketplace and check out who happens to be there. But there were others who were there. They were philosophers. And you know, I bet when I walked past that pub on Thursday night, there were loads of philosophers there. You find philosophers in pubs and coffee bars. People have their own ideas. And there were two groups of philosophers that Paul makes, or Luke makes mention. There were the Epicureans, Epicurean philosophers. The Epicureans considered the gods to be so remote as to take no interest at all in what they did, have no interest at all in human affairs. Basically, they just believed in gods that had just started things off and then pushed off and left them to their own devices. They just thought that the world was due to chance, a random concourse of atoms, and there would be no survival of death and no judgment to come. That was their thing. Does that sound familiar? There's a lot of Epicureans around today, you know, who just think that, you know, if there is a God, he's remote, he's far away, not interested, and there is no life after death. So let's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That was their thinking, and that's what they wanted to do, just to pursue pleasure. And then there were the Stoics. Well, the Stoics were fundamentally pantheistic. and thought of the divine being as the world's soul. So everything was God. He permeated the natural order. And they believed that the world was just determined by fate. You know, let it be. Remember the song? Just let it be. That was a Stoic view. You can't make any changes, so let it be. So whether life is bad or good, make the best of it. They believed the world was determined by fate, so they sought through logic and discipline to live in harmony with the natural order. They just wanted to live in harmony with the world around. Does that remind you of people today? There are those who are so involved in environmentalism, and as a Christian, I think we should be involved in environmentalism, but some have become so involved, they've made the world a god. So there were the Epicureans, there were the Stoics. Now that raises a question. Who's in your marketplace? Think about it. You know, it may well be that the first thing you have to do when you go into your marketplace is not talk, but listen. Chat to people. Find out what they believe, what they think. See where they're coming from. What is their worldview? And if you come along to the small groups or the equip stream, that'll help you to think more about how you engage with people in your marketplace. Okay, let's move on then to the word for the marketplace. What was Paul going to say in the marketplace? Well, we find that he's preached good news. He had good news to tell. That's why he went into the marketplace, because he was so disturbed, so distressed about the state that these people were in, that they had no relation to God, they had no understanding of the true God, that he went and preached good news. And he preached the good news about Jesus, and he preached the good news about resurrection. Jesus and resurrection. And you know what that did? Oh, that created confusion. They said, what's this babbler on about? You know, he's talking about new kind of gods. There's this Jesus and probably Jesus' wife, resurrection. They thought that Paul was talking about two different kinds of God. Perhaps related, but, you know, they just didn't grasp because they came from a totally different worldview. And, you know, the reality is, when you start talking to the people in your marketplace, they won't understand you, first of all. They won't grasp what you're saying. If you start talking to them about Jesus, some of them think you're starting to swear, or some just won't have a clue what you're on about. And resurrection? Well, so many are like the Epicureans that you die and that's it. The confusion of different worldviews. And that's what we all face when we start to engage with people in the marketplace. And you know, that's why so many of us as Christians give up. It's too hard. We can't engage with these people. They don't grasp where we're coming from, and we don't grasp where they're coming from. But Paul didn't give up. Paul kept on. And in fact, he didn't have a lot of choice about it, because they said, come on, we want to hear more about this. We want you to explain these things. We're taking you to the Areopagus. Now, the Areopagus was named after the council, the judgment council really, that used to meet on Mars Hill. Now, it could be that they took him off to Mars Hill, or it could be that actually they just brought him before the council. Now, it's quite interesting, you see, because Socrates, just 400 years before, had been brought before this council for proclaiming new gods. And as a result, he'd been sentenced to take poison and kill himself. So it's a bit dicey for Paul. And sometimes, you know, when we start to talk to people about the good news of Jesus, it puts us into a dicey position. And you have to do what Paul did and just trust in the Lord Jesus to take you through it. So, Paul had to explain what he was talking about. So let's look at the word explained. And you know, it was interesting. Last week, we were looking at where Paul started, and he went back to the ancestry. He went back to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He talked about the Old Testament patriarchs. He talked about the prophets. He's in a marketplace. These people don't know that. So where does he begin? He starts with, who is God? And he actually picks up, having walked around, he's noticed that there is an altar to an unknown God. Now that probably arose, the story goes, that at one stage in Athens, they had a plague break out in the town. And none of their gods, none of their sacrifices were doing anything about it. So somebody had a bright idea that he'd bring a flock of sheep. And everywhere a sheep settled, they'd sacrifice it and put an altar to an unknown God. Well, somehow it seems to have worked. The plague stopped. Perhaps it was that all the rats died or something, I don't know. But that's why there were these altars to unknown gods around. And Paul was able to say, well, you're a very religious people. I saw all these different altars, and I saw this one to an unknown God. He could have said, you're a very superstitious people. And you know, you'll find when you get into the marketplace just how superstitious people are. Did you notice when you were watching the Olympics how many, when just before they started a race, would cross themselves? Have you noticed how many footballers do that? Is it because they're really, Christian? One or two are, but others it's superstition. But Paul, as you do when you're standing before people who, could influence what they might do about you, said, you're very religious. I've come across this altar to an unknown God. Well, let me tell you about who this God is. That's quite a clever move, because they couldn't accuse him of actually saying he was introducing new gods. He wasn't. He said, look, I'm going to tell you about this God that you actually don't know. So who is God? He starts right away. God is the creator of the universe. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth. That's who I'm telling you about, says Paul. That's where we begin. You want to know about this God who's created all things? I want to introduce you to him. He's not gone away. He's not left you to your own devices. He's not leaving you just to get on with fate. He's actually interested in you. He sent his son Jesus. I want to tell you about this God who is the creator of the universe. And maybe that's where you'll have to start in the marketplace. Talking to people about the God who is the creator of the universe, because they don't know the Old Testament. They haven't got the biblical history that most of us have. They do know there's debates going on about creation, how it came into being, was it a big bang? So you then start to get in. Look, I can tell you about something that you don't know about, but I can introduce you to the God who created everything, the Lord of heaven and earth. And he doesn't live in temples built by human hands. You can get to know God where you are. So he introduced God as the creator of the universe. But God is also the sustainer of life. He's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. So he said, look, you might have all these altars, all these idols, and that, you give sacrifices to, But God doesn't need that. He's the one that sustains you. Now, of course, you can actually say, well, yeah, okay, that was Athens and they had idols. This is 21st century, I was going to say England, better say Great Britain, as we've just won all those medals. We don't have idols. Have you ever been online and read the Daily Mail online? I don't recommend reading the Daily Mail. I'll probably upset a few people now, but when you go online, you might, and sometimes you pick up an article and you think, oh, this is interesting. But all down the side, there's pictures and snippets about different celebrities. What is Wayne Rooney doing today? And, you say we haven't got idols? Some Arsenal fans will be really upset that their idol has deserted them and gone off to Manchester United. The idols are so unreliable. But don't tell me that people don't have idols. If they're bankers, their idol may well be their bonuses and how much they can make. If they're businessmen, their idol may be just how much work they can do to raise the profits and get more and more money in. There's so many different idols. And they need to know that actually all this effort, all this work following idols doesn't achieve anything. God is the sustainer of life. He's the one who cares. He's the one who provides. He's the one who looks after you. That's the God that Paul is introducing them to. And then God is the ruler of all nations. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. That's interesting. That's God. He says when empires shall rise and when empires shall cease. He says how long he will let a ruler rule. He allows a nation to expand and then puts a stop and says enough is enough. You can only go so far. He is the ruler of all nations. He's in control of all things. That's the God that Paul is introducing this people to. So that leads us to ask, okay, where are human beings in all this? Where are they? Well, Paul says, look, you're ignorant. That's not going to win many favours, is it, to turn around and say you're ignorant? Actually, the word in the Greek is the same word from which we get agnostic. So that's why they were saying, to an unknown God. We don't know who this God is, where he is, or whatever. But, we're just hedging our bets, so we'll have an altar to an unknown God. There's an awful lot of people in our society who do that. Oh, I'm not sure whether I believe in God or not, but when hard times come, I'll pray to him. Perhaps he'll look after me. Or when I buy my lottery ticket, I'll pray to him. So Paul was proclaiming to them good news about a God that they're ignorant of. So we also find that they're not seeing. See that verse 27. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out to him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us. That word, reach out for him, the idea is actually groping. It's actually like a blind man. Cannot see, but he's groping, looking out that God might be there. That's what they were doing. They're raising altars in case God was there. Many of them thought he was, I was going to say miles away, but he was way, way out of their realm. But they were groping. And Paul says, look, it's actually not far from any one of us. And when God set the boundaries of the nations, when he restricts the time in history of the nations, it's so that men and women will seek him. So when we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, and God said, enough is enough, that will stop, then we saw also a rise in religious interest within those former Soviet Union countries, a desire to seek after God. But they were groping, as all people that we see in the marketplace are groping. They're not seeing. And then we find that actually they're out of kilter. They've got things upside down, the wrong way around. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. People are like a man looking through the wrong end of the telescope. They make God small. They think that they can create an image of God. And for us, it may not be an image made of wood or stone. It's an image in our mind. We carry God in our pocket, as it were, that when troubles arise, we can drag him out and hope he'll do the trick. Just to give an example of how out of kilter people can be. There's a very interesting article in the Times newspaper yesterday. And if you can get hold of a copy, I'd recommend you read it. He's not the God of the gaps, he's God of the whole show. And John Lennox, who is writing the article, is writing about a man called Lawrence Maxwell Krauss. He's a Canadian-American theoretical physicist who is a professor of physics, foundation professor of the School of Earth and Space Exploration, and director of the Origins Project at Arizona State University. That's a bit of a mouthful, isn't he? Quite a bright man, you would think. He was talking about the Higgs boson particle. You know about that. You heard it in the news. You read it in the papers, how they'd found the God particle. And he said, humans with their remarkable tools and their remarkable brains may have just taken a giant step towards replacing metaphysical speculation with empirically verifiable knowledge. So they've moved from philosophy, from religion, he would say, to actually something that they can see and observe. The Higgs particle is now arguably, he says, more relevant than God. Now there's a man out of kilter. There's a man who's looking through the wrong end of the telescope. Thankfully, John Lennox, who is Professor of Mathematics in the University of Oxford, Fellow in Mathematics and the Philosophy of Science, and Pastoral Advisor at Green Templeton College, Oxford, says in this article, actually, Krauss has got it all wrong. He says, so what can we say about the Higgs boson? Simply this: God created it. Higgs predicted it. And CERN found it. We rightly celebrate the last two. What about the first? Now, I would suggest if you read an article like that, if you read some of the stuff that John Lennox is producing, some of his books, some of the other Christian apologists, when you get into the marketplace, you'll be able to talk to people about things like this. That's what they're interested in. That's their worldview. They listen to something like Lawrence Krauss has said, and they say, oh yeah, this means that we don't have to worry about God. It doesn't take much to challenge that view. I would say let's start to draw to an end. What's new then? This is what Paul is saying. What's new? Remember, these are people that they lived and spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. You know, that does sound like 21st century Bournemouth or 21st century England. People do like new ideas, new thoughts. What's new, says Paul? Well, the time for ignorance is over. That's what's new. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance. He overlooked the fact that you didn't recognize who God was. You didn't really seek after and find the true God. He overlooked that. But now he commands all people everywhere to repent. Because Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. So there's no place for ignorance anymore. And when you go into your marketplace, this is the message that you have. The time for ignorance is over. God has sent his Son into this world that men and women can have a relationship with the living God. They don't have to grope around for him anymore. They don't have to touch out and feel like a blind man. He's revealed himself. He's displayed himself in Jesus Christ. That's the message that you have to take, that there's no longer any room for ignorance. And more than that, a man has been appointed to put things right. A man has been appointed to put things right. For he set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. And he's given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. That's the good news that we have to bring. That the resurrection of Jesus Christ points to a new world order. Points to a new creation that we can all share in, take part in. That the scales there is the sort of symbol of justice as we know it. And in fact, it's the symbol of the international symbol of justice. And you can't actually have someone who's more international than Jesus Christ. He's going to judge the whole world. But you know, when we think of judgment so often, we just think of the judge with the wig and, you know, condemning some and approving others. But you know, if you go to your Old Testament, you'll find that the judges there were the leaders. They were the ones who saved Israel at various times. Jesus is the one, yes, who will judge, but he'll put everything right. So if you're a Stoic and you think, you know, you just have to cope with the world order as it is and try to relate to the world around you and just put up with any pain or suffering. Look, the good news is that Jesus is Lord of all creation. And all the wrong things he's going to put right on that final day. And we know that he's going to do it because God raised him from the dead. Jesus raised is good news for some. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. Some of the people you talk to in the marketplace, when they hear you, they're going to sneer. Be prepared for it. Be ready for it. You will be sneered at. Some said, we want to hear you again on this subject. Actually, this is interesting, you know. And sometime, not now, but we'll hear you again. And you'll find that over the coffee table or in the pub. Some will say, that's very interesting. Sounds good for you. Perhaps I'll hear you again someday on it. But you noticed? Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus. one of the council members, one of the leaders, and also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. Not a large number, but there were those who believed. What about you tonight? Are you sneering? Are you saying, oh, I'll hear a bit more some other time? Or are you ready to believe? We're going to sing. We're going to sing, I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene. Wonder how he could love me. We're in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene. Jesus the Nazarene is the one who's going to judge the world, the one who's going to put everything right. Let's worship him as we sing.